Haven't, if the fire alarm goes off, we all panic and we exit by either of the doors on either side of me here, or the door in the corner, or the door that you came in, and we muster over on the grass where the benches are and the sign that says, please stand here. Also, the toilets are between the two glass doors, and gentlemen's toilets are in the corridor at the back. That's really all I'm going to say, other than to welcome Scott, who's going to tell us all about his treks up Kilimanjaro and the work of the Vine Trust, which is what he was raising funds for. So a warm welcome to a very cold Moffat, Scott, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today about the Vine Trust and the Kilimanjaro expedition. So it's hard to believe it's actually over a year now since the trip. You'd maybe recall when I was here last in March that I gave you some of the background to the Vine Trust. So what I thought I would do is give you a very brief recap of that, and then before I launch into the slides about the climb. So the Vine Trust is 40 this year. So we began in 1985, started off as a charity shop called Branches in Bo'ness, and you can get the reference there from John 15, I am the vine and you are the branches. So Branches started by giving out grants of around £10,000 a year it was to different projects abroad. But then it developed over a number of years into an international development charity with a particular focus on medical work and medical ships in the Amazon and in Lake Victoria. So we're probably best known for the medical ships today. So up to this point now, we've actually completed 2.6 million medical consultations in the Amazon network, and also in Lake Victoria. So I suppose the focus of the Trust is that we go to the places where no one else is. So we're the largest provider of medical care in the Amazon and in Lake Victoria. So we reach the people who are unreached by other organisations. And all of this is organised from our offices in Leith, which is a converted barge. And we very much, the focus of what we do is partnerships. So we don't organise all these things from Edinburgh. Everything is very much done on the ground with local partners. So we're not just involved with the medical ships though, we're also involved with a number of construction projects. One of them is this here, which is in Moshi in Tanzania, which is quite close to the base of Kilimanjaro. So the purpose of TOREF, which stands for the Tanzanian Women's Research Foundation, is to provide accommodation for single-parent families. And you can see this is the sort of accommodation that the families are living in. And the families are identified by the charity and by the village elders, who then get involved with, they ask us to coordinate the house build. So to date, we've constructed, I think, over 150 of these houses, and this is just one of them on a trip a few years ago when I was out with a vision team. So you can see, I mean, each house, I think, costs about £4,000. It's very similar to the kind of standard of, that's the style of house that you would have in the area. So it's constructed from adobe bricks, which are compacted earth with straw, and then they have a tin roof. So quite different weather conditions that they've got to deal with. They get very heavy rains, but the temperature's broadly similar all year round, between kind of 20 and 30 degrees. So we've also been involved since 2018 with the African Inland Church of Tanzania on the development of a village called Kizunzu. And the land for the village was owned by the African Inland Church. And the idea behind the village is that it's a community of foster families that look after HIV orphans from the islands and the lake. So Lake Victoria is huge, it's vast. I mean, it's about over 800 times the size of Loch Lomond. So it's more of a sea. You can't see the other side of it when you're standing on shore. But it's very much, it's a fishing area. There are over 400,000 fishermen. But coupled with that, there's a lot of poverty. The islands in the lake don't have access to any medical services, and the rates of HIV in the area are as high as 30%, whereas in the country as a whole it's about 2.5%. As a result of that, there are a number of kids living there without any living relatives. And prior to this point, I suppose quite often they would be looked after in an orphanage or that sort of environment. But the African Inland Church, they had this vision that we could create a village for foster families so that the children could be looked after in a Christian home, and it would be a family environment which would give them far greater access to opportunities in the future. So in order to support all this work, we send out volunteers, and we really are a volunteering charity. So we have pre-COVID, we had over 400 volunteers, and that was a mixture of medical students who would be going out on their electives to the medical ships. We also had school groups that went out to help with the Toreth house building project, and we also have corporate groups. So we had a few groups from Babcock, who are one of our kind of corporate sponsors, who went out to Kuzunzu just before COVID, and they are starting to. We had our 40th anniversary celebration at Rosyth. They hosted that for us at their base, and they have a 5-year partnership with us when they're going to be sending out some of their staff to work in the projects. So, moving on, I think it was, I was first out in Tanzania in 2019, and that's at the beginning of the development of the village at Kuzunzu. And then I was out again in 2022 with a vision group, so we bring people out to see, get a flavour of all the work that's going on. And when we were out there, we just had this feeling of, well, after COVID, it's quite hard to gain momentum again. A lot of things died away. Unfortunately for us, because we're a volunteering charity, we really rely on our previous year's volunteers to inspire the next year's volunteers. So we'd lost a bit of that continuity. So the thought was, well, how do we raise the profile again of what the Trust is doing? And wouldn't it be good to do a sponsored climb of Kilimanjaro, because we're right in the foothills of Kilimanjaro where we're working. Now, that seemed like a great idea in 2022, and then time passed by, and we had to come good on that pledge. So in the end, there was 9 of us, myself included, who decided to make the climb. And we were quite fortunate because a number of the people who we partner with around Moshi have experience with the mountain, because it's a huge industry. There's maybe 30,000 people who will climb Kilimanjaro every year, and you have a whole team of people from the villages round about who will support you. So you'll have porters who will climb with you, and mountain guides. And you're not allowed to enter the national park unless you have a registered guide. So it's a lucrative industry in the area. And you can imagine how they were affected by COVID, because they went from 30,000 people to nobody, and they didn't have a furlough scheme like we had. So we had all the contacts with people there who could help arrange this trip. So it all made a lot of sense, and 9 people signed up. So to give you an idea of where we are, so we're just south of the equator. You'll see that Tanzania just sits on the southern shores of Lake Victoria. You've got Kenya to the eastern shores, and Uganda to the north. And Tanzania, the name Tanzania actually comes from, so it's Tanganyika and Zanzibar, and they were joined together when they gained independence. And that's where Tanzania comes from. And the capital is Dodoma, although the largest city is Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean. And you'd see there where the proximity of Lake Victoria, so the village at Kuzunzu is on Lake Victoria, and you'll see there's a place there called Mwanza. And Mwanza is the second largest city with a few million people. And as you can imagine, one of the biggest industries around there is the fishing, and they actually export a lot of tilapia from the lakes all around the world. So you'd maybe be able to make out on the map there on the right in the centre where Moshi is, and then immediately to the north of that you'll see a wee triangle in Kilimanjaro. And so Kilimanjaro, many people think that Kilimanjaro is in Kenya, but it's actually in Tanzania. It sits right in the border, although the border is, well, you've got the Masai Mara there to the west, and the border is effectively some large stones, and I don't think that the Maasai people certainly don't acknowledge, that there is a border. It's very much a modern interpretation. So this is a close-up view. You'll see there are quite a number of different routes available to climb the mountain, and we took the Marangu route, which was also known as the Coca-Cola route, because it's the route it's probably the most developed of them all. And you have a series of mountain huts that you stay in, so there's no camping involved, whereas the other routes you have to camp. And you'll see there's all the routes are from Tanzania, so you can't climb from the Kenyan side. And that area in green is the national park. So in order to enter the national park, you have to have, be with a registered company. So it's all quite well controlled, which is important because climbing Kilimanjaro is quite a dangerous activity in the sense of with the altitude. You're 19,500 feet. So it's the highest freestanding peak in the world because it's a volcano and it sits right on the equator. You'll see in the map here all the different camps and the different routes. So you'll see the Marangu route on the right-hand side, and we've got huts all the way to the top, whereas other routes you have to go to different campsites. And so the photo on the right there, this is my friend from the church, Ronnie, and we're standing just looking over so you've got two peaks there. You've got Mwenzi Peak on the right and Kilimanjaro itself on the left. Now, Mwenzi Peak used to be higher apparently at one point, and there was a huge explosion, and it's quite a jagged, inhospitable peak. You would only be allowed to climb that if you have to sign a disclaimer because you're not going to be rescued. So you're only allowed to go if you are a registered, if you're a mountaineer and you've got the skills to do it. It's all rope work. Whereas Kilimanjaro itself it's not a technical climb. Anyone should manage it with relative fitness. The problem is the altitude, and that's the kind of unknown quantity. So the other interesting part of it is the fact that at the base camp at Marangu, at the gate, it's plus 30 degrees. At the top, it could be minus 10, minus 20 with a wind chill. So you're dealing with plus 30 and then minus 10, and you've got to have all the equipment to deal with those extremes of temperature. And you would see the different climate zones in the map here. So you start off in a rainforest zone, you move through an alpine zone, then you're into a kind of Arctic tundra, and then at the very top it's like a glacier there still. But you'll see in the photo on the right, there wasn't that much snow. The photo I showed you earlier on from 2022, there was a lot more snow coverage because that was in November. So we chose to climb in September, mainly because you've got rainy season, dry season, and this is September is they call it the kind of mini dry season. So you don't really want to be climbing out with those periods because it'd be miserable conditions at the summit. And so this is the gradient profile of the route that we chose. So it's in feet and miles. So you've got Marangu Gate. So you're starting off at 6,000 feet. So you're already starting off 1.5 times, or Ben Nevis effectively. Ben Nevis is about 4,500 feet. And then you'll see Mandara the first day is 5 miles, and you're up about 9,000 feet, and then you're up about 12,000 feet at Harombo Hut. So that's very much kind of alpine altitudes. And then up at Kibo, you're at 15,000 feet, and then at the top, you're 19,341. So, some of you might have heard of a mountain in Ecuador called Cotopaxi, which I think is about 3 meters higher than Kilimanjaro, but it's another volcano. But you can be driven almost to the top of Cotopaxi, but to the point where the engine starts struggling because of the lack of oxygen, and you have to walk the final, 1,000 meters or so. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through the days of the climb to give you a flavour of what it was like in each day. So the route that we chose was 6 days, so you have 5 days up and a day back down. You don't want to spend any longer than you2 at the top, and you're actually not allowed to stay at Kibo, the highest hut, for any longer than 24 hours. So here's the full team. And made up of friends from the church, friends who I work with. You might recognise Ryan and Rebecca. They were here and took part in the service in March. My friend Andy Brown on the right there, so he's an ex-Marine, a good motivator and kept people going. And my friend Ronnie in the centre there, and my friend Graham on the left-hand side, who I've known since I was 3. So he lives in London, and I think the only exercise he did, or the training he did for this, was climbing up and down a few stairs in a building occasionally. So he had probably the least training out of everybody. Ronnie and I were climbing Munros every weekend that we could beforehand. But yeah, I say you don't need to be super fit to do it. And so on day one, you're walking up through, I say, what's very much like rainforest conditions, and you wouldn't really notice any wildlife until you stop. And you look into the woods on either side and you'll see these monkeys. So there's quite a number of them. And you'll see them, here's one here on the right, hiding away. And on the left there, you'll see we have guides, and there's a guide for each day. And your guide will give you, the most important thing they do is they pace you, so you're not going too fast. Because the most important thing about a Kilimanjaro climb is acclimatising to the altitude. So you don't want to be running up and down, you want to be taking it as easily as you can. And so the guide's job is really just to pace you and force you to walk slowly. And Ibrahim was very experienced. They go through, the guides start off, when they're, they start off as porters, and they kind of graduate, they work their way up until eventually they become the most experienced porters and the guides. But there was 9 of us, but there were 30 support staff. So 30, an entire village came, because they all know each other, and literally they're all from the same community. And so out of those 30, we had the 5 guides, we had a chef, and we had 24 porters. So we carried, as you'd see, a day bag, and then the porters would carry your overnight bag, and that would weigh 15 kilos. It wasn't allowed to weigh a gram over 15 kilos. They had to be weighed. But quite often they're carrying them on their heads. And see what it does for their neck muscles. They carry buckets of water. There's guys walking up and down with egg crates. So hopefully they never slip at any point, but they're carrying 200 eggs on their back, and they're running up and down. I mean, they're maybe doing that 4 times in a month. But it's quite strictly controlled in order to spread the economic benefit of it. So you're not allowed to do more than a certain number of trips in a season, because it's very lucrative in terms of what they earn per day compared to other forms of work. So the first camp that we got to is called Mandara. And you see we stay in these sort of, A-frame huts that were very comfortable, and you're just at the edge, you're just at the very edge of the rainforest zone at this point. So you're up on the altitude here, so you're already up about almost 9,000 feet. At this point, you don't really notice the altitude too much, but I suppose you're maybe taking more breaths than normal. But it's quite a good day just to break you in just 5 miles. So you're already, when you land at Kilimanjaro Airport, you're already at 4,000 feet. So that shows you relative. And this is what the accommodation was like. So, as I say, pretty comfortable. Only problem was at night. The monkeys were jumping off the roof of the huts to keep you awake, so you don't get much sleep. And there's lots of other interesting noises from the woods that you don't want to ask too many questions about. So there's lots of interesting wildlife. Again, as it is here, the wildlife's more scared of us than the other way around, so you don't tend to see much of it. And you'd see on the left here, so we were very well catered for. You think that our porters and the chef would go ahead of us and had everything ready for us in the huts, and there was a race to see who could get to the kind of the dinner hut, because all the different guides are competing against each other. So they were very keen that our group got the best accommodation and we got the best hut. So they would run ahead to make sure that we weren't left with the substandard accommodation. And they fed us very well. They made sure that at every point you were well hydrated. I mean, they're carrying lots of water for you. And they give you, it was that's the kind of millet porridge we had there, a kind of brown porridge. But they'd give you sausages, lots of egg-based things, omelettes, and as many things with eggs as you can think of, just to give you more boost your kind of protein. A number of the group were vegetarian, which was probably a decision they maybe regretted as the time went on. On day one it was fine, they had a nice vegetable stew, but after 5 days of vegetable stew it started to become a bit samey, whereas we were very well looked after, and even up until, you imagine it's difficult, you've got no refrigeration, so there's lots of dried food, dried meats and things, but it was no complaints at all about the food from our side. So one of the things that they did in the morning and in the evening was they'd check your blood oxygen levels. And they recorded that, and that's a requirement of the guides of the park authority. And they were trying to monitor to see, I mean, people's blood oxygen levels would drop, down to kind of in the 80s and then go back up, but it wasn't a linear as you climbed, because your body started to adjust to it. You're able to take, there's a heart drug called Diamox, which they give you, which increases the number of red blood cells, I think. And most of us were taking that, but again, as we'll discover, to limited effect. So the second day from Mandara up to Horombo was really interesting. So you start recognising the vegetation, because it looks more like our vegetation. You get fir trees and things that look more like what we would see up in the Cairngorms, for example. And then we passed this interesting creature called a tree hyrax. So it's a tiny wee thing, about that size. But apparently its closest living relative is the elephant. So how that figures, I don't know, but that's what we were told. And they were quite happy. They were more like sloths. They wasn't really bothered by what we were doing at all. And then in order to help us to acclimatise, they would take us detours, and it seemed really frustrating, because you saw where the path was, but they took you a much longer way around. But it was a good example of where if you didn't do that, then you'd have been really struggling by the end of the day, because the temptation always was, oh, there's a mountain there, let's just keep pushing on. So they took us to see this crater where there was probably millions of years ago, there was an eruption and this crater was formed. And from this point, you can actually look over into Kenya. So because you've got such a prominent position on the border and it's low-lying plains round about you, you have an incredible view over East Africa. And you would see the mountain comes into sight, but this isn't Kilimanjaro, this is this other peak, Mwenzi. And you see how jagged Mwenzi is. And many people have lost their lives climbing Mwenzi, and it's not, it's probably of a similar technical ability to some of the Himalayan peaks. So very few people will actually climb it. And this is a kind of team photo as we were on the way out there. So you'll see the type of vegetation that you've got round about, very alpine. And you've got flowers like this. So it's still beautiful scenery. And you would see, this is the first point in the climb when you actually see Kilimanjaro on its own. And there's still some snow at the very top. Now, I know a friend who climbed in the 60s, and he said that the entire top of the mountain was a glacier. And I'll show you a photo later on, but the glacier has now shrunk back to maybe 5-10% of what it was even then. It also doesn't help the fact we're in dry season, so very dusty underfoot. And that dust was actually one of the hardest parts, even more than the lack of oxygen, was that you're breathing in this dust. And you get this thing, they call it the Kili cough, because everywhere you go, you're choking up. You're pulling dust out your ears and you're choking it up because of all this stir everywhere. They then took us past this unusual conical peak, which was actually, I think it's the Chato tribe in that area. They had used this as a burial mound and for sacrifices, and they would bring goats and cows up to this hill. So it's still classed as a sacred area that we're not, tourists aren't allowed to visit. So you'll see at this point you're opened up and you're onto almost a plain. So it's actually quite easy walking, but again with the heat of the sun you notice it. And at every point you would stop, they'd always have soup for you, loads of spaghetti, as much starch as you could possibly eat. and had lots of chicken and different meat, so they were always keeping an eye, and anything that we didn't eat, they ate. Nothing was ever wasted. It puts us all to shame. So we arrived at Harombo, and you're at 12,500 feet now. We're above cloud base. Still get a mobile signal, which seems crazy, but that's. But believe it or not, Harombo camp was almost totally destroyed by a wildfire, and you could see in the distance behind where all the charred remains of some of the huts were. So you'll see the huts they've been built. They're starting to build new huts there on the photo on the right, and incredible view from this point. I would say this is probably the stage where you started to notice the altitude more. It felt like you almost had a cold, like you had some congestion. It just didn't feel quite right. But again, you're up at about 12,500 feet. So that's your kind of, I suppose, your kind of, your alpine ski resorts would be probably certainly no more than that. But the accommodation is really quite interesting. You know, it's this is probably the best accommodation of all the huts that we stayed in. So you see these kind of bunk beds there. The less said about the toilets, the better. There's not much you can do when you're halfway up a mountain other than dig a big hole. And you'll see in the photo on the left-hand side, you'll see there's this interesting contraption with one wheel. So if you fall and you break your leg or something happens to you, that's how you're getting out of there. You can pay extra for the helicopter service, which again will only go so high because the helicopter can only fly so high on the mountain. But that's how you would be brought down. Sadly, we did see somebody who had to get brought down on one of these stretchers. So on day 3, rather than continuing up the way, they took us again round the way. They took us to see this place called Zebra Rocks, unusual kind of rock formation. And the purpose of this was purely just to get us used to the altitude. So you'll see we got to 13,500 feet. And then you would see in the distance the path winding off up towards Kibo Camp. And so this was quite a long day. I would say this is probably one of the hardest days because Kibo was way in the distance. But you noticed everything. It was like having a weight on you. It was like at the top of the mountain you've got half the oxygen than you have at the base. So it's like having it's like having one lung really. You're down to one cylinder, and you notice it. So very sparsely, there's very little vegetation. There's just, you see, it's kind of scrubland tundra. And this is probably the most public toilets that I've ever been to on the right-hand side there. And they would always time it carefully that you had a place to stop for lunch, and they were always already ahead of you preparing lunch for you. So they looked after us very well every point. And then we reached Kibo. So Kibo, you don't get much time at Kibo because you're not allowed to stay there for longer than 24 hours. So you get to Kibo, and if the weather was closing in around the mountain, you had to abandon. You'd have to go back down and come back up again. So we were fortunate the weather conditions were good for us to continue. But you really notice this. You're at 15,500 feet. Every step you take is laboured. And then, unfortunately for me, this is the point where I really started to notice the altitude because my nose started bleeding because your blood's thinner at that altitude as well. And my nose wouldn't stop bleeding, so I just had to plug my nose and hope that I could keep going. But you only get a few hours at Kibo because they want you to start climbing as soon as possible. So you arrive here at 4 in the afternoon, but you should start climbing at midnight. And you don't sleep because your heart's racing. So you're lying there. And you don't feel particularly hungry either because everyone feels a wee bit nauseous at that point. So you see you're up at 15,500 feet and you have this incredible view looking back towards that mountain of Mwenze. And these were the unfortunate people who chose the camping option. So there you can see you pass different groups as you go. You kind of leapfrog some of them, and you see you have some parties who are, you say they're camping or they're coming in. Lots of people converge on Kibo because many different paths lead to this camp. But this was our accommodation. And this was our last meal that they gave us on the right about midnight. So you'll see me in the middle there with my bloodied rag on my nose. So this is the point when it's freezing. When you're at that altitude, it's the sun that gives you strength. because you get the heat from the sun, really keeps you going. So at this point, it's below freezing, and the stars are incredible. It's like another 10 layers compared to even what you'd have here. And at this point, you're gathered at the base, and you'll see the climb in the photo on the left. Up until now, it's been quite a gentle incline, but on summit night, it's like this. So you go from gentle to a very tight hairpin, and you really notice it, and this is when it's the hardest climbing. And this is when, some people walked with red lights rather than the normal light, just to help so you didn't lose your night vision. But you're in a convoy of people snaking back and forth up the mountain. But our guides, we could hardly talk to each other because of the lack of oxygen, and yet they were singing. So, and they were singing in Swahili, and I thought, I recognised that, and I thought, and suddenly realised, they were singing "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" and "How Great Thou Art" in Swahili. So we could try and sing along in English while we were struggling, but it was, so they tried to keep the morale up, and it's incredible that they have the lung capacity that they can still sing at the top of their voice as you're climbing. So you can see in the photo on the right there, the lights in the top left, or in the middle left, are in Kenya, and on the right-hand side it's Tanzania, and then the lights below us are the other groups that are coming up behind us. Now, unfortunately, this is the last photo that I took at this point, because my altitude sickness got, steadily worse. I was sick once, and I said, I'll keep going, I've got nothing in me now. And then I was sick again, and then I was sick a third time, and I thought, okay, that's me, because your water's frozen. So, and unfortunately, I made the mistake of taking one of those, these kind of glucose gels that people take when they're cycling. So I can't touch them now. They've been ruined for me. But there was nothing I could have done. So at this point, Ibrahim, the guide you saw at the beginning, he stayed with me, and unfortunately I had to go back down, which was really frustrating because this is at 5:30 in the morning and the sun's about to come up, and we then give you the strength to go on. But the last thing I wanted was to become a casualty and to then have to use one of those stretchers. So, and you can't, even at this point, they would have to physically carry you because you couldn't even, it was so steep. So the rest of the group continued. They didn't tell them that I hadn't made it. They just kept saying Scott's behind us because they didn't want them to lose morale, because people start to become quite emotional when there's a lack of oxygen. So you can see how people were feeling at 6 in the morning as the sun was coming up. So you get this incredible sunrise over East Africa, and everybody feels totally miserable, like nobody wanted to continue at this point. Everyone just wanted to go back. There's no fun involved at this stage. You just want to get there. So the summit is called Uhuru Peak. It was called, up until the independence of Tanzania, Kaiser Wilhelm Peak, because it was a German colony. And so they renamed it Uhuru Peak, which means freedom in Swahili. So they kept climbing, and you get to a place called Gilman's Point, which is about 18,000 feet. And I made it just within spitting distance of Gilman's Point. So I made it to about 18,000 feet. And I know that because when you take a photo on your phone, the GPS locates it for you, so I could look back and see exactly where I got to, which was handy. So continuing on, this is how everyone felt. You can just tell. Ryan and Rory in the middle just felt burst. And then the problem is you get to the top and it's a bit like Ben Nevis, there's a queue. So you get there and you think you're the only people there, and you've got a queue of 100 people waiting to get their photo taken. And you've not slept yet, so you're totally sleep deprived and miserable. So Ryan and Rebecca were just trying to catch up there, and my friend Ronnie, and incidentally, Ronnie and Geraldine, they were both 67 when they did the climb, and the youngest is probably Rebecca, I think she was 28. So there's quite an age range, and this was them all together. And my friend Ronnie managed to make sure he was the highest A90 supporter in the world, briefly. He actually got interviewed by Rob McLean at Somerset Park when he got back to talk about his experience, so it was a good publicity for the Vine Trust. So again, you had to wait. Because there's people converging on the mountain from all different angles. Because it was good weather conditions as well, people wanted to make the most of it. Because quite often you get to this point and it's just freezing rain and snow and it's miserable and they have to turn back. So that's Uhuru, 19,341 feet, or I think it's about 5,895 metres. So quite an incredible height to get to. The funny thing is, it doesn't ever feel like you are that high, mainly because it's all relative to what's round about you. But when you consider that the domestic flight that we then took to get across to Lake Victoria to the village at Kazunzu was flying at 18,000 feet, so you're walking at the same height as the plane was flying at, that kind of really shows you what you're at, the height you're at. And this is what's left of the glacier. So, I kind of, sadly, a fraction of what it once was. Which is incredible that there is a glacier at all, and the fact you're on the equator, so it shows you how high up you are. And then this was the next photo that I took on my way back down, and my objective at this point was to get back down the mountain as quickly as possible. And you've got to go down through all these tight hairpins that you've climbed in the dark, and it's like scree, so it's very difficult conditions to actually walk on. It's a bit like if you've ever ordered hardcore, like type 1 for doing something in your garden. It's a giant pile of type 1 is the best way I can describe it. It's just very loose scree and gravel, very hard to walk on. And you'll see this is how high. So I got to the top of the photo in the middle, and then Uhuru peaks way beyond that around the rim of the crater. And if you zoom in, you'll see the people in the middle and the left, and you'll see them on the right there. So that's what we were doing on the summit night, this tight convoy. And I got back down to Kibo and felt slightly better, and they said, no, I'm just going to keep walking. So Ibrahim said it was the fastest he's ever walked from Kibo to Harombo in his career. So you didn't want to hang around. You want, because you notice as you descend, immediately you're starting to feel better and more yourself. And that was where we walked. So you saw the photo earlier on at 13,500 feet looking off into the distance. So thankfully it was sunny for us coming down. And this is my guide, Emmanuel, who was carrying my rucksack on his head all the way down. And this is what it was like at night at Harombo. So the sky had cleared, the clouds had lifted, and you could see the lights that you see below there are of Moshi. And you might notice that there are more of these stretchers here than there were the first time. So some of them have unfortunately been used for people. And when the walk back down is, I say the objective is to get there just as fast as you can, but as a result of that, you're bringing up all this dust. So your lungs are even more full of all this dust as you're going down. But when we got back down to Mandara, and as always happens, there's always a reason for a song and a dance. And so they had a celebration for us near the bottom. And when you consider, like, your porters, they're being paid maybe $10 a day, and that could be doubled with the tips they're given. But the money that they make on that one expedition could last them for a few months. So it's quite a lucrative industry for them, and they very much take pride in making sure you have the best experience possible, and we're very, very well looked after. And that was us back down to the bottom. So my friend Graham having a well-earned bottle of Coke, and they still gave me a certificate for getting somewhere, which was nice. I'll need to replace it in the future I'll need to go back again. So if I was to go again, I would probably go by another route, probably Mandara route, which takes longer, but gives you longer to acclimatise. But there are quite a number of people, as a result of going, who've said, oh, I would love to do that, and they would like to come along. So it'd be good to do it again. And again, that's the summary of the whole route. And then back at the hotel at the end, they made a cake for us, which was very kind of them. And that was the best. When you get the night after, when you get down, just to get a chance to sit for a day and recover. My nose continued bleeding for 3 days after this, so it shows you the impact it had. And then it was Kili to Kazunzu, so the whole purpose of the fundraising effort was to raise money for the village. So the second half of the trip was flying over to Lake Victoria. And in order to get to Lake Victoria, you fly over the Serengeti. So it's a beautiful part of the landscape. You can see there's a huge crater that you pass, and I think it's in Ngorongoro National Park. There's a huge crater with the highest concentration of, your big five game, big animals. So it's beautiful countryside. And we landed in Mwanza, and then we travelled by an old land cruiser on the bumpiest road imaginable. You never complain about potholes again after you've been in one of these roads. And they took us over to Kazunzu. So again, this is the master plan for the village. Eventually the plan is to have 40 houses. At the moment there are 8 houses, and there's about 40 of the HIV orphans staying there, along with the kids from the foster families. And the school's been constructed. There's a BOMA, they call it, which is their community building, and they use it as their church. So we had a fantastic welcome. They broke off branches all around and ran over to meet us. So they knew that we were climbing for them. And it was a great experience to be, and especially there was quite a number in the group who had never been to Kazunzu. I'd been there twice before, but for them to get to see what they were raising money for. And I think that's the important thing with a small charity like the Vine Trust. There's a direct relationship. People can see exactly where what they've raised goes, and that level of accountability with everything is, I think, is really important. So the families are working very hard. They're growing crops. They were very keen to show us what they'd produced. One of the challenges we have right now is getting produce to market. It's easier to do that by boat than it is to do it by road. So we are looking to, through our partnership with Babcock, they've offered to give us a floating jetty and help to establish that, which would then mean that 2 of the medical ships that operate in the lake, they could actually visit and link up to the village at Kazunzu. So the kids brought us up to the BOMA, and there was singing and dancing, sharing of food, and we'd bought the kids. Went into a shop in Mwanza. I think they had two old ragged kind of footballs, and that's all they had. So we bought them all new footballs and brought them down. So they were very pleased with that. And it's a great, fantastic welcome for them. You'll see the school on the left-hand side there, and the BOMA, this kind of conical roofed building on the right. And my friend Ian had his cowboy hat that he took with him wherever he went, and it was very popular. So I don't think he had a chance to wear it very often. And then this was established, this cairn, by a church in Falkirk that gave the initial funding to allow the village to be established. So, and you can see that's the kind of master plan on the plaque there, looking out over the village. So very fertile ground around there, and you're looking down onto the shores of the lake. And then this is the school, which has just been completed, and all the kids with their football tops. Some fit better than others, but they're all very pleased. And then finally, we travelled back. Lake Victoria is an incredible place. I mean, there's lots of fishing happens at night, but the whole place there's so much energy around it. And you've got 400,000 fishermen. And I asked, we're heading across in this old ferry. It was actually like a landing craft that came from Scandinavia originally and was reassembled there because it's a landlocked lake. So when we took Jubilee Hope to Lake Victoria, we had to cut the ship in 2. We sailed all from Greenock all the way around to Mombasa, cut the ship in 2, welded it back together at Kisumu on Lake Victoria, and then sailed the ship down to Mwanza. But I remember asking the captain, and I said, what's to stop these people you could mow them down very easily? And he just said, well, they know to get out of the way. So it's not like what we have. There's no GPS or anything. There's people going around in dugout canoes and wee boats with no lights on them at all. And as I say, they just know to keep out the way. But sadly, 10,000 people die in the lake every year. So from fishing accidents, from drowning, all sorts of things. So it's quite a dangerous industry. And the islands in the lake don't have any formal medical. I think they've got a pharmacy in one now, but there's no medical facilities. So the medical ships visit on a regular basis, make a huge difference. They hand out antiviral drugs as well. And and the whole clinics and provide training. So this is the last photo here. This is the sunset as we were heading back over to Mwanza on the ferry. And you'll see that Ian's hat's been borrowed again. So it was very popular where it went. But you can see in the photo in the top right, that's the sort of boats that they used to use to travel around. And yeah, if you've not tried tilapia, it's very much like haddock, but everywhere you went, it was tilapia. Tilapia and chips was the order of the day. So that was the trip. It was an incredible experience. I think it was important that the group were able to go and visit Kazunzi afterwards so they could see what it was all about. Many people climb Kilimanjaro every year for charity, but the fact that we were raising money for a charity who works in and around Moshi and the mountain community and the porters, it meant a lot to them as well, the fact that we were able to do that. And there will be a future trip, if anybody knows anyone who is willing, after what they've seen, to try it themselves. So, more than happy to answer any questions that people have, but hopefully that's given you a good idea of what it's like to climb a mountain. But quite an incredible experience. I say it's over a year now since we did it, and it certainly will live with me for the rest of my life. And I'm quite keen. There are a number of people in Tanzania who are keen to climb with us as well. So I'm sure there will be another trip in a year or two. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Does anyone have any questions for Scott?
There was some running water in the early camps, but after a certain altitude, there's no running water, and they had to carry it all. So it certainly makes you appreciate water usage, because there's no water for washing or anything, because water's too precious. It's just for drinking. No, it wasn't. There was various water purification methods that they used. So the water they were carrying, they would purify first, and then they recommended that we would then purify it in our water bottles. Yes, iodine, or everything tastes of iodine or chlorine, basically. But when you're thirsty, then it's worth it. The problem was when the water, we used those, these platypus things with the tube, which were great, other than the fact that they froze. And I thought I was clever because I'd invested in one with an insulated tube. Didn't work. So it doesn't matter how good equipment is. I think when it's up Kilimanjaro, it's different. So. Yeah.
So I was going to ask about water, but the other thing I was going to ask about was about power. So you had your phone, and I was just thinking about charging your phone
That's a good question. So they had solar panels. And the interesting thing is, because Tanzania was a British colony before independence, they have the exact same plugs as us. So, albeit they don't have the 18th edition of the electrical regs. So, because my friend Bonnie's an electrician, and there's one place we went into where he said to everyone, don't use that, don't touch it. There's a bare live wire sticking out the corner of it. So, but some people were so desperate to charge their phones that they would risk a bare live wire. But what I did was I used a charging block. But my friend Graham, who's a photographer as well, he managed to get photos to the outside world, but I just I left my phone off most of the time and just enjoyed the fact I was away from emails for a few days. Yes, I can tell you that. So rather than raising individually, we raised money as a pot, and we raised 14,000. So we deliberately made it a pot so that if one of us didn't realise it would be me, but if one of us doesn't make it, then someone can't say, well, I sponsored you to climb the mountain and you only made it to 18,000 feet, so I'm going to have to take 10% off for that final 1,000. Okay. Well, I think I lost blood. Interesting thing is the Diamox, I took that, which was meant to help with the altitude, but it didn't help me, and I don't know if it actually contributed to making me feel sick. But the interesting thing is Marangu route has a 60% success rate, so the fact that 8 out of 9 of us made it was pretty good. Yeah. It's actually, they recommend, add on another day or 2 if you can. We had an unfortunate trip out. We were meant to have a day of acclimatisation beforehand, but we had an issue with our flights. So we flew with Qatar, and our flight to Doha was delayed, which meant we missed our connecting flight to Kilimanjaro. So we ended up going on an Ethiopian flight to Addis Ababa in the middle of the night, and then on to Kilimanjaro. So we lost that first day, and you really need that. So that's why if I'm doing it again, I would do an 8-day climb, because an 8-day climb's got a 90% chance of success. People have tried it in 4 or 5 days, but even super fit people like Marines, they would struggle. It's not about exactly. It's about the way your body processes oxygen and how much oxygen you can get into your blood cells. But because I'd say beforehand, people would have said out of all of us that I was one of the fittest because I was going up and down Monroes all the time. But I know somebody else who's climbed Monroes, climbed nearly all the Monroes, and he didn't make it. So I'll pretend that that's the reason. That I climbed too many mountains beforehand. I was obviously next time I should take a leaf out of Graham's book and just do no exercise whatsoever. Then I'll be fine. Yeah. Well, Comic Relief, when they did it, Gary Barlow didn't make it, and Chris Moyles did. And that was before Chris Moyles was a fairly larger man at that point and was a chain smoker, and he made it. But he was probably already operating with a reduced lung capacity, so maybe he was able to, his body could cope with it. But yeah, there is no rhyme or reason. I think we did very well to have 8 out of 9 people summit. The groups that were around about us, there were quite a number of dropouts from them. So, and that not even just before the last day, but even up to that. You also have injuries. Or, someone goes over their ankle or something like that because it's quite loose material underfoot. So yeah, I think we did well. And I'm glad that it was me that didn't make it, because I know I'll be back at some point, whereas they might not necessarily be back out there. And it gives me an excuse. I need to change that certificate. I can't just say that's me. I'm taking the helicopter today. I'll do the final 1,000 feet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott. I think everybody's enjoyed it. I think 18,000 feet is amazing. The last 1,500, who cares? Exactly. Just do half a Ben Nevis, it'll be the same. But I think you have had a really enjoyable trip, and I hope you do get a chance to go back again. But I think it's been very interesting for us to see what you do with the money that you raise with the Vine Trust, and what good work that you're doing in a place where a pound goes a lot further than it will in this country. All the money we're raising this afternoon from all you good people who are here will go to the Vine Trust. And I am sure whatever amount we raise, that it will be put to very good use, and Scott will make sure that that happens. And I'm sure that if you go back out and climb Kilimanjaro again, you'll come back and tell us what it was like from the top this time.
I hope so.
But
see how much of the glacier's left.
Let's hope it's still there, or at least a bit of it's there. And the wee furry animal, I'm sure it's related to a bear, not an elephant. But thank everyone for coming along. We now have tea, coffee and cake, and there's plenty of it. So please do stay, have your tea, coffee and cake. And Scott and his dad are going to stay around, and you can have a blether with them and ask him any questions you didn't want to ask, because I know some of you are really shy and wouldn't want to put your hand up and ask him a question. But thank you very much, Scott, and have a safe trip back to Kilmarnock when we're finished here.
Thank you.